I'm Ian Porlupi, and welcome back to the Northland Workshop. Today we're going to take a look at wood turning for furniture makers. And I emphasize the for furniture makers part because the needs of somebody who builds furniture and occasionally needs a turned leg or a turned column or maybe some little drawer pulls like the Shakers used to make is going to be different than somebody who is a dedicated wood turner where this is the center point of their shop. This is obviously not the center point of my shop because we hardly ever see this corner. Let's take a look at what we're going to need to do some turning on the lathe, and then we will get down to actually turning on the lathe. So the very first thing we need to discuss is what lathe to buy. And there are lots of lathes out there ranging from cast iron behemoths all the way down to little mini lathes that sit on a workbench and you can turn pens on. Well, a tiny little lathe is not going to do what I need it to do because I need to turn furniture parts like table legs. So I need something with a longer bed. This one happens to have a distance of 38 inches center to center. And that's perfect because really the longest thing I ever see needing to turn is 36 inches, so this gives me 2 inches of wiggle room. It doesn't need the beefiest bed in the history of lathes. I don't have to land fighter jets on this thing out at sea because I'm turning spindles. They're long and narrow. They're not big wooden blanks for bowls. I'm not going to be doing bowl turning on this thing. And if someday I decide to turn pens, well, the nice thing is I can always scoot the tailstock closer to the headstock. It's a lot easier to do that and have bed left over than to run out of distance between the centers and scramble to either find a bed extension or have to sell that lathe and buy a longer one. Also, spindle turning does not take the type of horsepower that full-on bowl turning does, because again, everything's much smaller. In this case, it has an 1.5 horsepower motor on it, and that is plenty for everything I do with it. So, don't be afraid to buy a used lathe that might not be the most rugged thing ever, but has a long enough bed and has at least 1/3 of a horsepower to it. If it's 1/4 horsepower, it's probably not going to do what you want it to do. Okay, let's talk about the parts of the lathe. You have the headstock. That is the part that drives the workpiece. It usually has one or more pulleys in it in order to change the speed. More modern lathes also have variable speed drives, but at the bare minimum they're going to have a couple of pulleys on here that you can change the speed just like you would on a drill press. The business end of the headstock is the drive center. In this case, this is the old style 4-prong spur center. There's lots of different styles on the market nowadays, but if you buy a used lathe, this is most likely what it's going to come with, and honestly, for general purpose turning, this is perfectly acceptable. Then you have the tool rest, and in this case, this tool rest, you'll see I brazed a round piece of bar stock on just because after 90 plus years, this thing was pretty well worn, and instead of trying to sand it down, I just put this bar stock on. And if this ever gets chewed up too badly, I can always just replace it again with a new piece of bar stock. One thing you want to do is make sure that the tool rest is smooth along the top. If there's nicks in it, the chisel is going to catch, and every time it catches, you will get a little ridge in the workpiece to remember it by. So if you have to take a file to it or a piece of sandpaper and clean it up, do so. If it gets too bad, you can always take it to a machine shop or a welder and have them put a new face on the thing, kind of like this. The tool rest moves up and down in the part known as the banjo. And each lathe will have its own style of banjo. More modern ones usually have a lever in the front that loosens them up so that way you can move them in and out, so you can adjust how far from the piece of wood the tool rest is. This one is old, it requires a wrench. You can also get different length tool rests. I have, for my lathe, a much longer one that actually requires 2 banjos to use. And this is a very nice tool rest for spindle turning because, again, the longer it can be, the less often I have to reposition it. I've also seen people make their very own tool rest out of wood that goes the entire distance of the lathe for turning really long spindles, so that way they never have to reposition it. At the far end of the lathe, we have the tailstock, and the tailstock is movable. You can actually slide it up and down the lathe bed and then lock it into place. And once it's locked into place, you can go ahead and turn the knob and advance the quill to trap the workpiece in between the dead center and the drive center. Now this is a dead center, which means it doesn't turn, and when I lock it down like this, it doesn't even wiggle. So you have a fixed point here and a spinning piece of wood that requires some kind of lubrication. In this case, I just lubricate it with the same oil I use to oil the rest of the lathe, but you could use candle wax, beeswax, all sorts of different things in this cup center. Speaking of cup centers, this is the cup center. So you have the point that the workpiece turns around, and then you have this sharp cup all the way around. And the idea with that is twofold. One is you can pack it with lubricant like, say, candle wax, and that will lubricate the wood as it sits there and spins. And the other thing is the cup digs into the wood and provides a secondary pivot point around the primary one, so that way you don't wedge it in there to the point where it splits the workpiece. This is kind of an antiquated setup, just like this whole lathe basically. And nowadays you usually see what's called a live center, which means there's a ball bearing in here, so the center actually spins with the workpiece, and therefore you don't have to oil the end of the piece of wood. If you buy a used lathe and it has a dead center, don't worry, it works just fine. Just be aware you gotta oil it, and if you squeeze it too tightly between the headstock and the tailstock, the end of the wood might start smoking. So if it starts smoking, just back off on it a little bit and maybe add a little more oil. Either way, that is the primary anatomy of a lathe. We have the lathe, we know what the parts are, what they do, that's great. Now we need tools to actually shape the wood. And if you buy a used lathe, it might come with some old tools. And by all means, try them out. You'll have to sharpen them, but if you buy new tools, you're going to have to sharpen them out of the box anyways. But if you don't have any tools yet, I have 2 different starter kits from 2 different manufacturers here, and these represent really the 2 schools of thought with wood turning right now. And again, I'm a furniture maker, I am not a full-time wood turner, so again, my take on these things is going to be different than somebody that does wood turning all the time. Here we have the infamous Harbor Freight Windsor Design $82 8-piece wood turning chisel set, and they work perfectly fine for me. They're high-speed steel. Their high-speed steel isn't nearly as good as some of the better named brands, but again, $82 gets you 8 turning tools. Now, A couple of these I've never used. These two scrapers right here that come with it, I've just never used, but I have used all the other ones and they work perfectly fine for me. And the fact that I'm not doing wood turning all the time, these are going to last me a really long time. The biggest thing is they require sharpening more often. But again, I don't do it that often, not a big deal. For the price, I can't complain. That's the conventional tool side of things. We have the latest and greatest that is carbide insert tools. Now these are the Grizzly, the 4-piece set. I believe these were $84 when I bought them. They were on sale. And so for $2 more, you get only 4 tools, but they have carbide inserts in them. The big benefit to the carbide inserts is there is a much shallower learning curve than using the conventional turning tools, and you don't have to sharpen them. You can get a diamond stone to hone them if you so choose, or you can go online and buy replacement inserts dirt cheap, and when you run out of sides to turn these things to, you simply toss them in the garbage and put the new insert on, and away you go. And these things last for a really long time, especially, again, I'm not a full-time wood turner. So if you're just starting out in wood turning and it's not the primary thing you're going to do in the workshop all day, every day, I would suggest getting the carbide inserts. Forget about the conventional ones unless you feel so moved to play with the conventional ones. But if your end result is you want turn pieces for your furniture and you don't care about how you make them, the carbide's going to be cheaper in the long run, because even though you get 8 tools for $82 and these were $84, there's one big hidden cost when it comes to conventional tools, and that is hiding right over there in the corner. Welcome to where all the money goes when you use conventional tools. No matter where you buy them from, no matter how much you pay for the turning chisels, you're going to have to sharpen them before you use them the first time. And then throughout your time using them, they're going to need to be touched up repeatedly. High-speed steel does not react well to the standard gray, cheap grinding wheel that you can use in a high-speed grinder to sharpen your lawnmower blade. It also doesn't like high-speed grinders, period. So you need a slow-speed grinder. Now this happens to be an ancient mandrel that I paired with an equally ancient motor, but you can buy low-speed grinders. Now when you see the price of a low-speed grinder, you will understand why I took the time to assemble this thing out of old pieces. They're not cheap, and you want to make sure that it's in the sub 1800 RPM range. Otherwise you run the risk of burning your tool steel. Then you need something that can actually grind tool steel, because even the cheap Harbor Freight tool steel is still harder than, say, a bench chisel or a plane iron. You can get ceramic wheels. Ceramic wheels come with their own issue of they're fairly expensive and they wear down, just like a regular grinding wheel. As you use them, the grinding wheel wears away, and you have to get a diamond dresser to square the thing up on occasion. So they have these things known as CBN wheels, and it's like diamond impregnated on the wheel. It's not actually diamond, it's about half the hardness of diamond, but it will last the regular wood turner a lifetime, which is good because these wheels are not cheap. A pair of these like this is around $300 shipped to your door. So brace yourself for that. I have 180 grit wheel and a 600 grit wheel. I use the 180 grit wheel to shape the bevel of the different tools initially when I get them from the factory, or if I buy a used one, and then to sharpen it I use the 600 grit wheel. Along with the wheel and the grinder to spin the wheels, you have the expense of some type of tool rest, because whatever tool rest comes with your grinder, I guarantee you it is not adequate to support these things well enough to get the kind of precision grind that you need for turning tools. So this is a very popular one. This is a one-way system. It has this V-tool on it to hold the gouges, so that way you can just turn them. Well, here's the thing with this. For CBN wheels, it specifically says in the literature that comes with these, the warranty is void if you use this attachment right here, because these things are very aggressive and they could catch and scrape all the grit off of it. So forget the V attachment, which is fine. I didn't buy it for the V attachment anyways. I bought it for this rest. So not only do you have to learn how to use these tools in relation to the wood, you have to learn how to use these tools in relation to the grinding wheel. It's not an impossible task. People have been figuring out how to sharpen conventional lathe tools forever, and they will continue to do so. However, again, not our primary focus with this thing, so I would suggest starting out with carbide tools. It's just simpler that way, and cheaper than all this plus this. But wait, there's more. The CBN wheels do a great job making the bevel and all that good stuff, but it leaves a burr on the inside of the tools that in the old days of high carbon steel tools, the burr would just wear off in use and you didn't really have to worry about it. Or if you were that concerned about it, you could get a slipstone and simply clean up the inside of the gouge. However, these things do not react well with slipstones. They're just too hard, even the cheap ones. So one more expense with the conventional tools is a diamond slipstone, and you can see this isn't a conventional diamond stone with square edges. This is actually kind of in a raindrop shape with a curved edge, and you can use that in here to clean up the burr that's left over from the grinding process. Now this thing is very handy because you can actually hone the edge in between sharpening. So I can usually hone this edge 10 to 15 times before I have to go back to the grinder. And when I go back to the grinder, it's just to the 600 grit wheel. It's not to the 180. That's kind of a one-time when this comes out of the box type deal, or if something seriously weird happens to this. But normal circumstances, I can get away with just honing it, and then once I finally find it's taking too long to hone the edge, I can go back to the 600 grit wheel, clean it up, and then hone it again. You want to hone it after grinding it for optimal results, but again, another expense of the conventional tools. If you're concerned now that I'm only going to show you how to use the carbide and not the conventional, don't worry. In just a minute, when we start turning the wood, we're actually going to turn the spindle first with carbide, and then for those of you interested in the conventional tools, we're going to do it again with conventional tools, so you can see both methods and we get the same result. So, what wood are we going to practice on? Well, the nice thing is, it's just a practice piece, doesn't really matter. What I've got is a scrap piece of 2x4 that I ripped down the middle. And you can actually see this is an old 2x4 because it has a nail hole in the center of it. So the first thing we need to do is find the center of this piece of wood, and I do that just with a straight edge and connect the dots from corner to corner, then I'll take a scratch awl and poke a hole in it, and that'll make it a lot easier to mount to the lathe. I'll do that on the other end too. On a more modern lathe, I would take the drive center off and using a rubber mallet tap it down into the end of the workpiece, so that way the teeth dig in. Here it doesn't come off the headstock without a whole lot of fuss and a couple different tools, so what I do on softwood is simply smush it on with the tailstock. However, on hardwood, I will actually take this over to the vise, take a handsaw, and cut the diagonals in it to give the teeth something to bite into. So, I put the center punch on the point in the center, and then I bring the tailstock up, and I want it within half an inch of the end of the piece of wood. I don't want it smushed all the way up there because if I'm doing table legs, there's 4 of them, I want to be able to just back this off without having to move the whole tailstock, especially since on mine there's no locking lever for it. I actually have to use a wrench in the back to lock this down. With that firmly locked in place now, I can go ahead and advance the dead center up, again with the point hitting the center punch, and now I start cranking. And if we look, we'll see the teeth are biting in, and now that this is tight, there's quite a bit of resistance turning this thing right here. That's not going to make the dead center real happy when I start turning. So now what I do is I back it off just a little bit until it becomes easier to turn. Just about like that. And that's something that just requires getting the feel of it. I'm set up to start roughing out this workpiece, and I have the longest tool rest installed so that way I can go from one end to the other without having to stop and reposition the tool rest, and I have the height of the tool rest set so the very top edge of the carbide insert is directly in line with the axis of rotation. So the easiest way to do that is to make sure that the very point of the drive center is right in line with the carbide insert. And to hold the carbide insert tool, I want to make sure that it is dead flat, parallel with the floor. I don't want to tip it up. If I tip it up, I'll get a nasty catch and it'll propel the handle of the tool up, and if it's down, it's just not going to cut quite as effectively. So for best results, I want to hold this thing level. The other thing I need to do is I need to figure out the order of operations for this thing. I'm pretending this is a table leg, which means the top part is going to stay square the whole time because that's where the apron joins into it. So I need to make a pommel cut, which is the transitional cut from square to round. I want to do that first because if I start out roughing out the cylinder without making the pommel cut, there's a good chance I'm going to get tear out on these corners here, and the square part is going to be spoiled by that. So I want to make that pommel cut first. For the carbide insert tools, the best thing I've found to rough out the cylinder is the square radius cutter, which sounds like an oxymoron, but what it is a square insert with a slight radius to it. It's a 2-inch radius on the square insert, and that just helps make it a little bit nicer finish. However, for the pommel cut, I want to use what's commonly referred to as a detailing tool, and this is the pointy diamond shape insert, and I find that's the easiest way to make the pommel cut. Now this insert, if you see, has a radius on the end. And depending on the look I'm going for, I might not want a radius at the end of that pommel cut, in which case I have this detail tool that I got off Amazon that has the same size insert, but it has a point on it instead of the radius of the other one. Now I could have just put that insert in this handle, but I like having both of them. So just be aware there are two different detail profiles for this. Normally when you think roughing out a square blank into a round cylinder, you think slow speed. And for the bulk of it, yes, that's what you want. But what I've found with the carbide tools for the pommel cuts, you need to run this thing at a fairly fast speed, otherwise you will get tear out no matter how carefully you go. And speaking of how you cut it, what I want to do first is just come in with the detail tool and essentially I want to point it in the direction that I want the pommel cut. You can make a square pommel, you can make a tapered pommel, or you can make a rounded pommel. First thing that I need to do is to cut that edge. And I want to feed this in very slowly so I don't get tear out. Let's see how we do. What I don't want to do when making the pommel cut is just jam this thing right in there, because as the wood starts to cut on both sides, the chance of this thing catching and launching up at me increases significantly. So what I want to do is now come in and remove some of the waste over here, and then I will come back and continue until I get a circle all the way around. Right now I have flat spots here. You'll also notice that I have this other cut right here. That's simply because I've had to do this twice for different cam angles. There, as you can see, I now have it round all the way around. If this was an actual project and I knew what diameter this leg had to be, I could use my calipers and keep going until I get that specific size. If I want to make this pommel a little bit more rounded, what I can do is come back in and with the side of the detailing tool very carefully start rounding this. Now I want to be extra careful with it that I don't blow out these corners. So let's see how this goes. There, and as you can see, we've essentially made it a little bit more rounded. And again, you can make it a straight taper simply by pushing it in without rolling it this way. And when I roll it this way, I want my whole body, because again, I've got this thing up against my side for better control. I want to move in one smooth motion. With it in its slower speed, I can now go ahead and rough out the rest of the round part of the leg. One thing you can do if you don't want to have to constantly shut the lathe off and check to see if it's square is, as it's running, as you saw me do, I placed the chisel on top of the thing and you could hear it bouncing and I could feel it bouncing every time it hit a flat spot. So I could, without stopping the lathe, just keep shaping it until it stops bouncing. Once it stops bouncing, I know it's round. Now as you can see, that is a very rough finish. Now these are scrapers, they're not really cutting, they're scraping, but even by scraper standards, that's a very rough finish. That's because it's turning so slowly. Now that I've got the corners knocked off and the chance of getting a really big catch is reduced, I can go ahead, unplug the lathe, move the belts over, speed it up, and we're going to see the cut quality improve. So now that I have it turned down to a cylinder, we can go ahead and start adding some details to it in the form of coves and beads, because when it comes right down to it, spindle turning is just a series of making coves and beads and connecting them in an interesting design. Now sometimes you want to replicate that design, or you have a set of patterns that you want to follow, and that involves using a set of spring calipers. You can adjust them with the knob right here, and if you buy them brand new, or even if you get them used, you want to make sure that you round the tips over, because they come from the factory very pointy, and that's dangerous because the points could dig in and send this thing flying at your face, and that's just not nice. So with conventional turning tools, you use the caliper in conjunction with the parting tool to neck down a section to the correct size, and then you do that in several places. You can play connect the dots. But the Grizzly kit that I got does not have a carbide parting tool. So in order to use the things in the kit, I'm going to use the detail tool as a pretend parting tool. It's not exactly the same. It would be a little easier with a real parting tool, but in order to stick with the things in one kit, this is what we can use. Now there are two ways we can do this. One is I cut in a little bit with the parting tool, or in this case the detail tool, and I simply cut in a little bit. I have to move it over slightly, cut in a little bit again in order to make it wide enough for the calipers to fit in, and I simply take my best guess at it, cut in, try it, or I can go ahead and with one hand cut in and with the other hand hold the calipers until they fit through. Now I want to make sure that I just gently rest them on there, because if I stab them on too much, they are springy and they will go around this thing even though it's not the right size. So let's try it out. So now, if I wanted that whole section to be that diameter, I could simply go ahead and do that. And for this, I would probably use the straight square tool. So let's try that out. So I can replicate any diameter I want with these. I just set it to whatever size and I can keep doing that exact same thing. Now let's make a cove. And for a cove, I have two options. If it's a very narrow cove, I can make it with the diamond tool. If it's a bigger cove or a gentle sweep, I'll use the rounded cutter. What I don't want to do is, this is roughly a 1/2 inch diameter. If I need a 1/2 inch cove, I want to resist the urge to just plunge this thing right in there, because when it grabs both sides, there's a good chance of this thing getting launched. So you don't want to engage the entire front and sides of any cutter in a cut at the same time, one edge at a time. So what I would have to do is go back and forth slightly to make the cove. Or if it's a cove that's this exact size or smaller, I would need to use the detail tool. So let's make a cove with this, and then we will make a cove with the detail tool. So we have a little cove that I made with the detail tool, and we have a bigger cove that I made with the regular rounded cutter. And if you noticed, what I did is I swept in from the sides again and again, meeting in the bottom. These are scrapers. Technically you can go from the smaller diameter to the bigger diameter, but I'm in the habit of always going from big to small with the standard tools, and I suggest you get in that habit, so that way if you get a set of standard tools, you're used to going from the outside down to the bottom and then the other side down to the bottom. And again, by doing it that way and taking a little bit at a time, I get a cleaner cut and I don't jam this thing in there and end up gnawing on the end of the handle. Let's make a bead. So if we start over here, first thing we need to make a bead is to remove material around the thing. So I want to use this in lieu of a parting tool once again, and I will go ahead and remove material. So now we have a perfect spot for a bead. We have options. We can use the rounded tool to make the bead in both directions. We can use the detail tool. We can even use the square tool if we simply spin the entire thing. It is totally up to you and what seems to work best for your particular style of wood turning. I'll demonstrate the rounded one for this side, and then we will do the detail tool for the other side. So we've got a bead that's pretty uniform right there, and when we sand it, it'll be fine. And we did that with two different things. Now one thing you'll notice is I was able to get that curve to go way down much closer here than I was with the rounded tool here. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now I'm going to combine these elements together right here, and we'll see kind of what you can do using coves, beads, and of course the pommel right there. And with a little bit of sanding, you could have the leg to a footstool. And as you can see, it's just a series of coves and beads. Some of the coves are stretched out, some of the beads are stretched out, and a pommel cut. And then at the very bottom, a little taper. So that's really all there is to doing spindle turning with carbide tools, and from then on out is just practice, 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 and some sanding. So let's go ahead and try the same drill with the conventional tools. So the first thing I want to do, just like with the carbide tools, is deal with the pommel cut. Now for this, I want to take my skew chisel and set it with the long point down. And what I want to do is have the bevel that's on the side of the skew chisel where the square part of the leg is going to stay. That needs to be in line with what I want the face of the pommel to look like. And what I'll do is, as this thing spins, I'll start with the handle of the skew down. As it's spinning, I'll lift the handle up, which will engage the point and start the cut. There. So as you see, I just barely nicked that thing. And that's what I'm looking for, because again, I don't want to split out these corners. Now that I did that, normally without shutting it off, I would move a couple degrees this way, cut in, move back, cut in, and I'll keep cutting back and forth until eventually the cut goes all the way around. Getting there. And I have to keep working at it from two directions because unlike the detailed tool that can go in and remove material off the top of it, this thing's slicing the fibers, so there's only so far it can go in before the cut stalls out. So I have to keep working at it from both directions, kind of like trying to cut down a tree with an axe. Now I'm all the way around, and if you look, there's no tear out to be seen. Now we're ready to start roughing out the rest of this leg, and to do that I'm going to use the roughing gouge. And unlike the carbide tools where I presented the cutter at a level angle to the workpiece, this, I'm going to present it with the handle dropped way down low. The reason for that is I want the bevel to hit these corners. As this thing comes around, the bevel's going to keep hitting. I'm not actually cutting, the bevel's just sitting there rubbing against it. Once I've made contact with first the tool rest and then the bevel is rubbing on the workpiece, I will slowly pull the handle up, which will eventually present the cutting edge to the workpiece, and it will start cutting as it comes around. And there's that big split I was talking about, so I'll just get that piece right out of there. The other thing I need to think about is, where do I start cutting with this thing? I want to start between 1 inch and 2 inches away from the edge. I'll start cutting and I'll move it over to the edge, so that way I remove part of that corner. Once I do, I'll come back here 2 inches and move forward again. That way it limits how big a chunk of wood can break off of there. If I start right in the center, it could rip this whole corner off, which on something this size, probably not a big deal, but on a bigger piece, could be a little more dramatic. So let's try that. I can remove a lot of material with the roughing gouge just like this. If I want to make a little bit cleaner cut, I can actually rotate this ever so slightly, so that way I get more of a shearing action on this edge. The other thing I can do along with that shearing action is tip it in a 45-degree angle or thereabouts this way, again to help with the shearing action. And if you look, that part that I did with the shearing action is quite a bit smoother than this. So the trade-off to the smoothness is it's not as an aggressive cut, which for roughing out a cylinder, I kind of want more aggressive cut with a rougher surface, just because I'm trying to get this thing knocked down to round as quickly as possible. So I'll go back to using this the standard way. The roughing gouge makes quick work of turning a square into a circle, but it leaves a very rough edge. So to clean it up, I turn to the trusty skew chisel. Now the skew chisel makes a lot of people nervous because if you use it wrong, it can catch violently and launch itself up and away. So what I want to do is once again ride the bevel, bring it down and over, so that way the cutting edge is at about a 45-degree angle to the axis of rotation. And while I'm writing that bevel, nothing's going to be happening. What I'm then going to do is start picking up on the top end ever so slightly, so I rotate it in my hand just a little bit until the cutting starts. And I want that cutting action to be in that lower third right there, like it's doing right now. If I have it too low and I dig in the heel, I'm going to get a very rough cut, and if I dig in that heel, a lot of times it'll try to corkscrew its way back. If I start cutting above the halfway point, this thing flips over, digs in the point, and then launches. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. This is where I say the conventional tools have a bit more of a learning curve than the carbide, because you've got multiple angles going on at the same time. The other thing I want to do is I want to shift this thing into high gear to speed things up just a little bit. Now what I want to do is use my calipers and the parting tool to once again lay out some dimensions. The parting tool, again, because this is a conventional tool, we're not going to stab it in with it level to the ground. We want to start by rubbing the bevel and picking up on the handle until it starts cutting. Now as it cuts, because the diameter of the wood gets smaller, I've got to continue to lift up, at the same time push in ever so slightly. So once again, you got multiple things happening at the same time, plus the fact that I'm going to be hanging on to these calipers. So just like the skew and the rough and gouge, this takes a little bit of practice. That I have the same diameter here and here, I have a couple options. I can actually take the parting tool and use the same peeling cut again and again to connect the dots, or depending on the size, if it was smaller than my skew, I could use my skew for that. However, in the Harbor Freight kit, I actually have a smaller skew, so I can do what's called a peeling cut. And what that is now I want the cutting edge to be parallel with the axis of rotation. We start high, once again rubbing the bevel, and then I will start lifting up the handle, and eventually the cutting edge will get contacted. And the easiest thing to think of is this is just a big, slightly slanted version of the parting tool. Rub the bevel, lift up on it until it starts cutting, and then slowly advance it into the work while still lifting. So let's try a peel cut. There. And I stopped cutting once it touched the turn down pieces from the parting tool. To make a cove with conventional tools, I like to use the detail gouge if it's a small cove. If it's a bigger cove, the regular spindle gouge will work. You don't want to use the rough and gouge because it's straight across and it's just not set up for details and codes. So it's tempting once again to just plunge this thing in. That's not the way this works. We want to start with this front edge vertical. If you come in at an angle like this, you're going to watch this thing corkscrew away. If you come in at an angle like that, it's going to do the same thing again. If you're like this, it's going to corkscrew away. So that very tip has to be 90 degrees. And it's kind of a scooping motion. You start with it high, you turn it, and lift up on the handle all at the same time. And just like that, you get a cove. And you can make it whatever size cove you want. Let's make a bead. Now the bead, I'm going to start out removing material on either side with the parting tool. So what I just did was I started as if it was a peeling cut using the long point of the skew. As soon as I saw it start to cut, I began to roll the skew over. Now at the same time I'm rolling it, I'm also moving the handle out because I need to rub this bevel on that curve the entire time. And then I repeat the process on the other side. And once I hit it with a little bit of sandpaper to remove the point at the top, we have a bead. So there we have cutting it to size, narrow curve, narrow cove, wide cove, and a bead. Let's put those three things together right here to form a little foot like we did with the carbide tools. So here we have the leg that we just turned with the conventional tools. Here's the leg from before that we turned with the carbide tools. And as you can see, we were able to make all the different cuts with both tools. So whichever one you use, it will give you the same result. It's just a matter of which one you want to go with. But I think a lathe is a valuable piece of equipment to have in any woodworking shop. So I hope this has helped answer any kind of questions you might have had about wood turning for making furniture parts.